Round 4 of the Tartar Steel chess tournament was full of drama. Let's take a look at the game between Levon Aronian and Hikaru Nakamura. Two of the favourites, I would say, to win the tournament. So, top clash here. After 31 moves, Aronian with the white pieces has a very pleasant position. Now, I think this is a nightmare for every King's Indian player. Hikaru Nakamura played the King's Indian, but he has no attack. The queens have swapped off very early on in the game, but Nakamura is left with this poor bishop running on the same colour as these fixed pawns in the centre of the board, and white has this splendid knight ready to come into the f5 square. It's a classic good knight against bad bishop position, and looking at the queen side, we can see this knight is beautifully placed. Tying black to the defence of the b-pawn. The knight protects, but the pawn cannot advance, of course, because a6 hangs, and white has a very simple threat in this position to advance the king into black's position. Very, very difficult for black to defend. For example, if bishop f8, then the king advances to c4. Black is so passive here. So Nakamura thought for some time and came up with a clever idea. Classic Nakamura, actually. First of all, he played bishop to f4, attacking the pawn. This comes forward, and then he nudged back with the bishop, well, forcing white's knight into this beautiful f5 square. Well, what exactly has black achieved by this? Let's have a look. He now played knight e6. So Aronian has a choice. He can either trade knights or take the pawn. Well, what happens if knight takes pawn? Now we can see why Nakamura just wanted to bring white's pawn to h3 rather, because this knight comes in with check and takes the pawn. And this looks very scary. You can see this pawn about to advance down the board, and it's turning into a race. And after a couple of minutes, Aronian rejected this and instead exchanged knights. But in fact, he should go in for this. Nakamura bluffed him out. This is actually very, very good for white, possibly winning. Now, it's very, very complicated, but let's look at one basic variation. White comes back with the knight. Black advances the h-pawn. It looks very frightening, but in fact, black's big problem here is that bishop. Because these pawns block, there is no real connection with the other side of the board, and it means that white can advance this pawn. And, well, I mean, this is a very basic variation. White can stop that pawn with his knight, and his own pawn is advancing through to the queening square. This is probably winning, but after just a couple of minutes' thought, Aronian exchanged knights. Now, this is still very good for white, and it still means that, well, in this position, only two results are possible. It's either going to be a win for white or a draw. But it looks as though Nakamura has a fortress here. It's very hard to see how white is breaking through. I think that here Nakamura should simply wait. I think if he plays bishop f4, it's very difficult for white to break through in this position. For example, if white plays a5 and brings the king in, now we can see that black brings the king round, and I think in this position has sufficient counterplay. The king is going to come through here and be able to attack the pawn, and white isn't quick enough on the queen side. I mean, that's one typical variation. But instead, after less than a minute, Nakamura lashed out with h5, and this looks like a mistake to me. I'm not sure that black is lost, but that pawn is now vulnerable and gives white another target, and as we know, two weaknesses can sometimes be fatal. Let's see how the game went. Now Aronian advanced. And here, if black waits, well, let's see with bishop e1. Let's see how white can make progress. So first of all, switching the knight around. There's a threat to play knight c7, checking and attacking attacking the pawn, so the king comes back. Now b5, this can't be captured, otherwise the king comes in. And now f4, excellent move. Basically, if black takes, then the knight comes in, and then the king comes in, must be winning. So black has to just wait, and now the pawn advances. And the king is just stuck now. You can see there's no real counterplay. And now there's a nice maneuver. First of all, we force the pawn to advance, come back with the knight. Now you can see that when white's king comes round to attack this pawn, black's king cannot come through because the knight controls this square. And basically white is coming round to pick up the h-pawn. Must be lost. So, I mean, well, another variation. If the bishop comes here, we advance. Now this is tricky. We can take this pawn. Now the knight actually is trapped on h5, but in this case the king comes in, and well, white is going to win this one. The pawns come through first. So Nakamura had a bit of a think here and came up with a5. Now b5 is possible for white here, but I think there are, well, instead Aronian took this very quickly. b5 was certainly a chance, but instead Aronian took very quickly and played king b5, which also looks extremely dangerous. But here I think black can still draw the position. I think if he plays king f7, now, I mean, I've looked so long at this, and all the variations are so confusing, but let me just show you the basic idea is that if white comes round to take the a pawn with his knight, then once again black has sufficient counterplay on the king side. I think he's in time. That's the basic idea. So it looks kind of counterintuitive to completely abandon the other side of the board, and particularly as the king side looks locked. But actually I think this may be a good idea. Instead, Nakamura played king d7, and this is definitely lost. Let's see how Aronian did it. First of all, threatening the pawn advances, the knight comes back, once again threatening the pawn. The bishop defends, and now the knight comes in, and because black's king is so far away from the king side, after this move white is winning. It's as simple as that. You can see the king is way too slow to come around here. Let's just examine this one very quickly. In fact, after knight c4, Nakamura actually resigned. Here it's a very different story. The knight blocks the bishop, and well, in this case you actually take this bishop, and well, white well, in fact, both sides queen. I mean, Nakamura could have played this. I mean, it is definitely winning for white. Let's just see this variation. Both sides queen, but well, I mean, there are various ways to do it, but this looks like a good idea. And now simply protecting the knight, and the knight protects the pawn, so everything is secure, and then the king can come over and attack this pawn. So definitely a win, and no disgrace in resigning there from Nakamura. Now, I think, seen objectively, that was quite an uneven game. You know, Nakamura bluffed out Aronian, and maybe Aronian didn't play this endgame perfectly, but I feel justice was done, and this was still a very good game by Aronian. His preparation worked perfectly. You know, he reached this favourable endgame and slowly outplayed Nakamura, and well, Nakamura was under pressure and yeah, lost the game. Okay, let's look at one more game. The game between Sergei Karjakin and Richard Rapport. Rapport started off very well in this game, but Karjakin slowly got a grip, and you can see with white he's bearing down on g7. This is a wonderful bishop, and Karjakin controls the b file, and he played rook b7, simply threatening to trade and then take on g7. But there was a bit of a shock awaited Karjakin. Well, I mean, maybe he'd seen this, I don't know, but queen a4 was played, and suddenly there's a threat here, and this looks a bit frightening. He doesn't really want to have to play his rook back to defend. Excuse me a moment. But he played rook b2, allowing black to take on b7 and allowing black to take on c2. Now this looks incredibly scary, but he'd calculated very well indeed. Let's see. Queen d2 check, and now if he plays the obvious move, trying to hide with his king on h2, in fact this is a mistake, because you can see black's queen can switch back and forth here. But instead he'd calculated that he could play king f1, and in this way white actually gets a winning position. Let's have a look at the difference. Now what about bishop d3? And this looks exactly the same. In fact it's not. You can see that the bishop was on f5, now it's on d3, so white can now interpose, and that forces an exchange of queens. And in this position, even though white is a pawn down, it's completely winning, because well, rook g7 check is threatened, and if here then rook a7. I mean, this is a beautiful position. White controls the 7th rank. This bishop is wonderful. You're going to take on a6. Black has zero counterplay. Must be a winning endgame. And what else is there? Well, if queen d1 check, then queen e1 just stops the attack. If queen d3 check, then the king can just move to the side and is completely safe. And remember, it'll be white's turn next. So after this, Rapport played queen d3 check, which forces an exchange of queens, and he was hoping, of course, to gain some counterplay with the d pawn, but in fact white is winning this position very easily, and Karjakin's technique was superb. First g4, this can't be taken because of a check here with a rook and taking the bishop, so the bishop came here. Now he can take on g7, but f5 is even better. That pawn is not running away. There's no rush. Rapport has no real counterplay. Now white took, and he played f6. The threat is simply bishop d6 and f7 and so on. So Rapport had to play rook c6 to defend this. And now after king e1, black resigned. So king e1 is just a very tidy move, preventing any nonsense with potential tricks with d2. And black has nothing here. Let's just see a possible continuation. Black can only wait. And now there are many ways to win, but g5 is simple. The pawn comes through. Black has to give up the bishop and piece down, and yeah, nothing to do there. White is completely winning. So good win from Karjakin. There was one other decisive game, a very long game that lasted over 7 hours between Dominguez and Caruana. Dominguez finally won after 108 moves. I'm sorry, I'm not going to show you that one. So that leaves Aronian on 3 points on his own in the lead, and so Hari Krishna and Giri and Karjakin on 2.5. Thanks for watching.